And thank you everyone for joining us. I'm delighted to have you on board for another ARACY webinar and welcome you to again our more relaxed format here in Studio ARACY. Before we begin today, I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we're all meeting on today. Lauren and I and our team here at ARACY are on Ngunnawal land, and I want to acknowledge the elders from that community who play an enormous role in the life of our community here in Canberra. I want to pass on respect to those elders, the past, present, and to elders emerging as well. Delighted to be able to bring this webinar to you. I think many of you would agree with me that over the last 12 months we've brought to you an interesting range of material in the lunchtime webinars that we've been running. This one is different. This one is very close to our hearts, and it's one that's been very important to us in its development because it speaks to something that's at the heart of what we do here at ARACY, and that is our NEST framework, and I'll allow Lauren to talk about that a little bit later. But from its inception back in 2014, one of the things that we've always been conscious of in the NEST framework is the need to expand on this domain of positive sense of culture and identity, to expand our own understanding of it, and then to bring that and make it available to you, the people who use the NEST framework. And I hope that today's webinar allows and gives life to that domain in a way that we've never been able to before. So I'm going to hand over very shortly to Lauren Renshaw, who is an incredible part of our team here at ARACY, one of our amazing researchers who has committed a huge chunk of her time over the last 12 months to this piece of work. We are so proud of the achievement that Lauren has been able to do in this report, and I hope you find it as useful as you hear more about it as we've enjoyed pulling it together. So thank you for your time. Thank you, Lauren, for your dedication to this piece of work. It is truly a great piece of work, and over to you.
Thank you for that introduction, Penny, and thank you everyone for joining us here today. So here to give you an overview of the project undertaken by ARACY on children and young people's sense of identity and culture. I'll be talking about what we mean by this term, why we should measure it, when we should measure it, and how it could be measured. It summarises a final report and 3 practice papers released earlier last month. So, as you can already see, we'll start with the main outcome of this project, which was the development of a conceptual framework on children and young people's sense of identity and culture. 2 important components that's worth pointing out at this point in the presentation are the 2 outcomes of establishing a positive sense of identity and culture. And this is self-worth and social connectedness. But how do we get to this point, and what do we mean by having a positive sense of identity and culture? So to take you back a bit, welcome to the NEST, which some of you might already be familiar with. It's a wellbeing framework for children and young people developed by ARACY, and it's made up of 5 domains which cover the areas in which a child or young person needs to be supported in order to be happy, healthy and thriving. So to be loved and safe, to have access to material basics, to be healthy, learning, participating, and to have a positive sense of identity and culture. These domains are formed through consultations with children and young people, in addition to experts, service providers, working in policy and other relevant stakeholders. The domain of having a positive sense of identity and culture, however, was a later addition following further stakeholder consultations. Since its introduction, NEST has been used by government and non-government bodies to coordinate and support policy priorities, service provision and data analysis. Ideally, the framework can be used to plan coordinated and collaborative responses across sectors to support the wellbeing of children and young people, ensure a holistic approach to providing services and support to children and young people that considers the whole child, and design research about children and young people that reflects an ecological model of wellbeing. It was evident that stakeholders struggled with the concept of the identity and culture domain. It was primarily assumed to be relevant only to special cohorts such as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander children and young people, or to focus on more descriptive elements such as birth country, religion and language. But it clearly had potential and was initially introduced to have a broader reach and to capture more nuanced elements of children and young people's wellbeing. So with funding from the Australian Government Department of Social Services, we conducted a scoping and literature review on what it means for children and young people to have a positive sense of identity and culture, how it can be distilled into indicators, and what kind of information is currently collected and available. So just to cover a few caveats, we acknowledge that the nest was not designed specifically to reflect or support Indigenous concepts of wellbeing. It's recognised that wellbeing has different meanings for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, families and communities, and that key wellbeing indicators for this group should appropriately reflect what they value important and relevant for living life well. So we recognise that there's further work to be done in this space in understanding how Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities conceptualise wellbeing and the outcomes they value, including around identity and culture. So it's important to point out that this work does not comprehensively reflect understandings of identity and culture in a non-Eurocentric context, in that it was limited to the grey and peer-reviewed literature that was available in English, although we made all attempts to consider and include a diverse perspectives and understandings of identity and culture. The aim wasn't to develop working definitions of identity and culture that could be applied to specific groups, or to provide a prescriptive list of indicators and measures for people to use. So our intent was to provide high-level guidance around conceptualising and developing indicators on a positive sense of identity and culture for all Australian children and young people, but acknowledging the diverse and multicultural context this presents. So what do we mean by identity? How is it formed? How is it expressed? It's certainly a popular research theme in the psychology and sociology fields. Theories and research can be broadly divided into those that look at identity at an individual level, a social level, as a developmental process, or centred on geographical place. In academia, a sense of identity can be broadly described as the level of positivity and meaning one gives to their past and their family's past, their current state and situation, their social relations, their ability to achieve and their future. I have in the next slide, I'm going to show you some broad definitions of constructs used within the topic, which various scales and other data collection tools try to measure among children and young people. Now, I won't go through them in detail, but it's enough to say that apparent across all these perspectives on identity is that it's multidimensional. An individual may have positive measures in some areas, so they might feel good about how they do academically at school, but negative in others, so they may have low self-esteem in how they relate to their peers and in social situations. What do we mean by culture? So, not to get too poetic, but it's fair to say that defining culture is much like trying to catch the wind in your hands. It means many things to many people, and no one definition will sit nicely within all contexts. However, I think that the definition provided by the Australian Bureau of Statistics within their frameworks for social statistics retains enough detail to identify important unifying elements, as well as flexibility to enable different adaptation to different circumstances. UNESCO also have a brief definition in their preamble to their Universal Declaration of Cultural Diversity, in that culture is a set of distinctive spiritual, material, intellectual and emotional features of a society or social group, and that it encompasses, in addition to art and literature, lifestyles, ways of living together, value systems, traditions and beliefs. So what are the overlaps between these two concepts? A theory that encompasses both is the socio-cultural approach to identity formation, which theorises that our development of a sense of self cannot be separated from the social values, behaviours, practices and mores that we're surrounded by. There's also the construct of cultural identity, and this reflects the level of engagement and self-identification an individual has with specific cultural groups. So how much this background accounts for their personal and social identity. What do children and young people say? Well, we've also synthesised the findings of research that asks children and young people directly what identity, culture, and their cultural identity means to them. There are several overlaps between how they describe these three concepts discreetly. These centre on what makes them special individually, but also what binds them to others. It's important to note that this list and the studies they reflect are not representative. For instance, you might notice that language is not listed here. It certainly emerged as an important component of culture, but didn't seem to pop up in terms of cultural identity or identity more generally, but this doesn't denote its relative importance to these two concepts. In the literature review, some potential risk factors to the development of a positive sense of identity and culture also emerge. And these in part reflect aspects of dislocation, so the removal from or absence of positive exposure to people, places and methods that are important for transferring family or cultural heritage, a lack of parental and social support, and experiences of trauma, oppression, marginalisation or discrimination. In terms of potential protective factors, these include exposure to a caring and stable home environment, family relationships and parenting practices, the opportunity to safely explore and experiment with dimensions of their identity, peer relationships that are supportive and based on non-competitive group norms, having exposure to positive and constructive messages about people and groups with a diverse array of characteristics and abilities, having positive perceptions of their neighbourhood and local community, and as a tangent of that, having opportunities to participate and contribute to their community, having access to knowledge and meaningful engagement with cultural heritage and practices, and having timely and appropriate support for trauma. It's also important to note that gaining a sense of identity and culture is very much a function of age and developmental stages. A child's sense of self and connection to family and community begins at birth. And in the early years, the backbone of this development is their relationships with those around them, their primary carers and siblings and other family members. Early learning environments, of course, also play an important role in this stage of a child's life. So having safe and supportive relationships that are framed by secure attachments and caring styles that are sensitive and responsive to the needs and their individual temperament emerges as an important potential protective factor at this stage of a child's life. In the middle years, so around ages 8 to 12, spaces outside the home start to emerge as an increasingly important environment for identity development and connection to culture. Peer groups and school environments are important influences and spaces, although family and the home environment, of course, continue to act as a touchstone for social support and social cues. Adolescence, of course, emerges from the literature as the pinnacle stage in an individual's personal development of a sense of self. It's established as a time of exploration where young people experiment with different subgroups, subcultures and behaviours. At this stage in a young person's life, the adults in their life providing opportunities to safely undertake this process has been shown to assist in them coming through this process to achieve a stable sense of self and a narrative around who they are and what they wish to become. As they emerge into early adulthood, an individual's identity expands to include complex personal and social responsibilities within workplaces and within carer roles. Spaces of development also expand to include greater involvement in the governance structures of society, including social welfare, medical and criminal justice sectors. Okay, so we've covered, although briefly, what we mean by the term positive sense of identity culture and what the literature suggests. The next question is, well, why should it be measured? Why should we measure it? Firstly, because it's an important part of children and young people's wellbeing. Having a stable sense of identity, so knowing who they are, where they come from, and where they'd like to go, has been linked in the literature to better outcomes across the board, both in academic and mental health areas. For children and young people from minority backgrounds, having a strong sense of cultural identity has also been linked to better engagement with learning, a resilience against discrimination, and a reduction in antisocial behaviours. Secondly, it falls within the responsibilities of government and child and family services. A child or young person's sense of identity and culture affects how they use spaces, both physical and online, how they interact with their peers, their family and community, how they learn and their health. Therefore, it remains relevant to stakeholders that hold the responsibility for these parts of a child's life. And this includes education and health sectors, community services, local government and other authorities. And lastly, it's a human right. The Convention of the Rights of the Child also includes several provisions that relate to a child and young person's sense of identity and culture. As an extension of the why measure question is the when and in what context could it be most useful to be measured. Having a positive sense of identity and culture can be measured in the context of establishing benchmarks and supporting the ongoing monitoring of performance outcomes of a service or policy, evaluating the impacts of a service or policy, or providing a descriptive snapshot or profile of a certain population or group during a specific time frame. It can ultimately help to locate gaps in support for children and young people to develop a sense of identity and culture within specific groups or broader populations. It can also help to establish how best to support this development by identifying levers for change, so utilising existing mechanisms or infrastructure to make a difference. It's also important to evaluating the intended and unintended impacts of services or policies on these outcomes. So how should we measure it? An important component of this is establishing indicators, and by indicators I draw upon the following definition. So a relevant variable measured over time or space that provides information on larger phenomena of interest and allows comparisons to be made. Based on the literature surrounding the formation of identity and connection of culture, in addition to best practice in how to formulate indicators, 6 principles were developed as part of this project. Firstly, that indicators should be grounded in theory and supported by a conceptual framework based on the literature. And I use the term literature loosely, so this can encompass a broad range of knowledge sources. Basically, indicators should be organised within the framework that shows their relationship to one another and to support the context in which they're measured and their use. Secondly, that indicators should be consistent with the Convention of Rights of the Child. Thirdly, the indicators should reflect the fact that enabling the formation of a positive sense of identity and culture lies with the adults in a child or young person's life. It's not something they should be required to navigate on their own. Number 4, indicators should be developed with the engagement of stakeholders, ideally representatives of the groups on which information will be collected and people that will be using the indicators. And number 5, the indicators should be focused on the outcomes of having a positive sense of identity and culture and the processes involved in their creation and display. It should extend beyond the common markers such as language, birth countries, and extend to measures of self-worth, social connection, and how these are created and maintained through an individual's childhood and journey through to adulthood. And number 6, indicators should ideally be useful to stakeholders and act as a lever for change. Aspects of feasibility should also be considered. Questions such as, do these indicators measure change? Does relevant, valid, reliable, and usable data already exist? And if not, where are the gaps? And if data doesn't exist, is it possible to efficiently and accurately collect? Do existing collection tools such as surveys or scales already exist that can be used and drawn upon? Back to the conceptual framework. So, as I alluded to before, it outlines areas that affect a child and young person's sense of identity and culture and how they relate to one another. It lists common markers of identity and culture, the environment in which they're created, negotiated, and maintained, the spaces in which this occurs, and the people that influence this process, and the ultimate outcomes of this process. The outcomes have been synthesised into two concepts: self-worth and social connectedness. By self-worth, I mean the perception of the capacity to achieve, so measures of self-efficacy, perception of self-value, so self-esteem, and hopes for the future, so aspirations. My social connectedness, I mean access and participation with groups, society and communities, perceptions of belonging and connection, perceptions of safety, experiences of discrimination and bullying, measures of tolerance and openness. The spaces and influences involved in the framework are those considered most relevant to children and young people. And as I mentioned before, this would vary by age group, with domestic and community spaces and family having a greater influence in the early years of a child's life, with peer groups, role models, and learning in online environments having a greater influence in a child and young person's life through those middle and teenage years. Emerging from this framework, conceptual framework, are key themes around which indicators could be based. These also reflect existing data set and data collection tools. These are quite broad and don't necessarily have exclusivity under this domain. They are equally relevant to the learning, loved and safe, and participating domains of the NEST. The NEST was always formulated with the intent that the different areas are overlapping and reflect a holistic view of a child. So this grid provides some guidance around how one could comprehensively cover important elements of having a sense of identity and culture, but also group them under different domains of the framework. So for instance, perceived self-efficacy and self-esteem in an academic context, so how a young person or child feels about how they can achieve certain academic outcomes, could be grouped under the learning domain or just as equally under the positive sense of identity and culture. So that brings you to the conclusion of my presentation, and there's the link there to the full report and the 3 practice papers.
Thanks, Lauren. That's really useful. I think that one of the things that really strikes me in the discussion, we've talked a lot in the last few weeks, and we've actually had an op-ed published recently around this as well, around the importance of participating, and it's particularly come up in relation to the climate strike stuff.
Yes, absolutely.
But I guess from what we can gather from your presentation is that we talked a lot about it. That ability to be able to participate in those strike actions was around child wellbeing, but it's not just that. It's actually around the formation of cultural identity as well.
How they feel their role exists within society as an individual, and their civic roles is very much a part of their identity.
Indeed, fantastic. You also mentioned at the very end the practice papers. Now, I know there are 3 practice papers. Can you tell us a little bit more about those? Obviously, ARACY exists as a knowledge translation organisation. We know that the detailed work that's gone into your long report is fabulous, but at the end of the day, many of the people who are listening today just wanted to be able to pick that up and say, how does it apply to me? And I'm just hoping that's what the practice papers do.
Yes, indeed. The report is, 75 pages long. Sorry, I do not suggest you read it cover to cover. Well, I do, but I understand if you don't. The first practice paper really focuses on potential risk and protective factors by age range, which I covered briefly in the presentation. And it also has a look at what that means to the education and child safety sectors. So, for instance, in the education space, it's about building upon one of the recommendations, well, not recommendations, but a list of things, considerations we've listed is building upon the early years learning framework, which has some really progressive indicators around establishing a sense of belonging and identity among children and young people. But we've also recommended and consideration around Indigenous language and providing opportunities for the teaching and learning in that space, and also promoting an inclusive and supporting environment in schools. And in the child safety space, we've really distilled some of the recommendations and learnings gained from various inquiries that have happened in that space as well, that are particularly relevant to a child's engagement with society and connection with family and cultural heritage and their background.
Fantastic. And so the practice papers are all on the website?
Yep. And I should also note that the second one really focuses more on the practical applications and guidance around indicators, and also provides some really practical examples of how other organisations have used the nest, and some examples of existing scales and data sets that emerge. And the third practice paper has a really comprehensive list of existing Australian data sets and scales and measures that measure things like self-esteem amongst children and young people, cultural identity, and gender identity and other aspects that cover that area.
Fantastic. I know, from an organisational perspective, I can't go, I have a health background, I can't go past, Margaret Chan's famous comment that said, what gets measured gets done. And I guess that what we're hoping to do with these practice papers and the big report overall is to be able to empower people to measure and therefore be able to do in this space.
Absolutely. And I think in a lot of ways people are already measuring these aspects, but it's about framing it in a way that really highlights in the sense of a child and young person's sense of identity and culture, which gives it a bit different slant about how that information can be used and how it relates to other aspects of a child and young person's wellbeing as well.
Fantastic. I know that a big part of this work was a collation of resources. Talk about that, please.
So, yes, I already mentioned in the third paper there's that list of existing data sets and scales and measures. But within the first practice paper, we've also provided some links to resources for educators and those working in the education sector that relate to how that inclusive and welcoming environment can be facilitated in that kind of in a school environment. So this includes BU resources and tools, emerging minds, but also some of the work that ARACY has done, so Common Approach, and our family and parent engagement work as well.
Fantastic. What's next? One of the things that I like about this project and why I've been so excited in championing it is that it's a starting point. We talked about it from the beginning and the outset of the nest. This was a piece of work that we wanted to do, and I know that from my perspective, we don't want this to be the end. We want the work to live beyond the paper and the practice papers. What are your thoughts about what's next around this?
Well, I think that's something that our audience today and other stakeholders would have the answer to more than me in a lot of ways. Both the nest and this domain is very much something that should be used and adapted and evolved to better reflect and better help maximise children and young people's outcomes. So we'd really be keen to hear from other people about how it can be used for their purposes, how they are using it for their purposes to achieve those outcomes.
Fantastic. So I guess an open invitation to today's audience that if this is something that you're interested and engaged with and doing work, whether you're doing your own work or you're building on the work that we've done through the paper, we'd love to hear from people so that we can grow our own knowledge, but ideally share that in that sort of knowledge translation that we as ARACY play as well. So please feel free to be in touch with us. One of the other things that we're going to do and we've undertaken to do is to ask questions that have come through the web. I'm going to hand over shortly to Paul Kinderman, who's going to take us through through those questions. But I just wanted to respond to a question that actually came in even before we started today's webinar, which was about the availability of this information, and particularly the slides and commentary from today. Dale did speak at the opening introduction saying that, of course, the webinar will be available for financial members on the website shortly. But if you're somebody who's not a financial member of ARACY, obviously I'd encourage you to join. But if you're particularly interested in getting hold of today's slides and this commentary, just get in touch with us anyway. So definitely, whoever asked that very early question, we can get you the slides from today as soon as we can. So I'm going to hand over to you, Paul, to take us through some questions.
Thanks, Penny. And thanks, Lauren. We've got a few questions rolling in, and I'm just interpreting them as best I can. But the first one goes to the environment in which children find themselves and how that shapes their culture and identity. And I think the question is basically what you found, so the environmental factors that shape culture and identity for a particular child, so whether it's out of home care or, or school or, just generally home life. What did we find? What are the gaps? What's our thinking?
So undoubtedly, all those factors you've mentioned play a direct and indirect role in the self-worth and social connectedness to a child and young person. I mean, particularly in the situation where they're in contact with the child protection system and in foster care. I mean, it's difficult to know where to start in answering that. I mean, we know that the family plays such a vital role in the early years in building the foundation for a young person to establish a healthy sense of self and to feel safe and confident in exploring their identity and what it means for them. There are certainly different theories about that process in that exploration process and then managing an achieved sense of identity. And a large part of that is having strong social support and strong relationships with not just parents but whoever their primary carer may be. And so, yeah, I guess that's been shown to have direct influence on measures of self-esteem, their better learning outcomes, which are often related to their perceived self-efficacy, so they feel that they can achieve certain outcomes, therefore they're better engaged in learning. So yeah, environmental factors, vast array, play a very important role in ensuring that a child feels that they're socially connected and that they're of value and can achieve certain goals.
Thanks, Lauren. We're getting a lot of questions specifically around education and the impact on identity and culture. One question poses, one questioner has posed the question, can what is happening at school counter what's happening at home? Identity and culture. I think we all understand the importance of parent engagement, but Lauren, I'll let you answer that.
That's a tricky one. I think there's a lot more research around the reverse, that what happens in the home can counteract what's happening at school. But it's not something that I directly looked at in terms of countering what might be happening at home. So I'm hesitant to I guess, reference specific studies that might account for that. But certainly, research does show that children learn better when they're in a safe environment, where they feel valued as a student and as a person. So certainly school and the relationships that are at school among peers and with teachers play a really important role in those specific measures of a child's life in terms of their self-esteem and how they feel like can achieve certain goals. And so, yes, it might not necessarily denote what's happening at home, but it certainly plays a really important role.
And certainly from just a sheer point of view of where people spend the majority of their time, kids tend to either spend their time at home or at school. And at the end of the day, both are very powerful influences and creators of the circumstances that allow for either risk or protective factors.
That's right.
in the generation of a positive sense of culture and identity. I certainly think that, and I'm really pleased that there's so much interest, thanks Paul, from education the education sector in this, because I think in the traditional way we think of school, I mean, I think we talk a lot about crowded curriculum and that we're trying to use schools to do more than they're necessarily there to be done, and some of that is around there's positive sides of all of the domains of the nest. There are certainly things to do with all of our domains incorporated into the school system, but it's still a powerful period of a child's life when they're there, and we've heard in some other work that ARACY's done with in the out of care, not out of home care, out of school hours care space. One of the things that one of the people who we did some consultation work with said was that he felt that he was the most powerful influence in some of the children he was caring for's lives. He was the most consistent person that they ever had the chance to interact with. So I think we have to be really mindful of if nothing else, of the sheer time and space that schools provide for us to be a positive influencer.
Absolutely. I think also, it changes within age range too. So I think as children turn into teenagers, school retains something a bit different than it does in the primary years as well. So it becomes a place where they really try to establish a sense of self, and where they're getting messages from lots of different people about how they're valued and what they can achieve in life. So definitely school remains a central component in those middle years and teenage years of a child's life especially.
While you're talking about age, there's another question that's come in, and it really goes to how early does this start? For example, the importance of the first 1,000 days in the shaping of a positive culture and identity. Can you talk to maybe what you found or what's missing,
Sure.
where the data gaps are?
Well, yeah, it's interesting that you say data gaps, because there's a real dearth in scales and measures that are to be applied directly to young children, and I think that's reflected in the data that's available too. A lot of information collected in this area from children and young people is very much parent reported or teacher reported, and there are various reasons around that. I mean, it's hard. Developmentally, children don't think about themselves as individually and their connections to other in the same way that a 15-year-old does. But certainly there is a bit of a gap there in validating different scales and measured in that age range. What we do know is that, from early as a few months old, children, babies can distinguish different groups and different people by various characteristics. So, defining themselves as opposed to other people and the relationships there begins very, very early. So it begins at birth, and certainly that parental relationship certainly begins at birth, and attachment begins at birth. So yeah, those early years are vitally important.
I think as many of our audience today would have seen, new campaign that's hit the TVs and certainly the social media. I like to refer to it as the gorgeous little blue monster, who talks about the formation of positive relationships to grow babies' brains. And I think that's something that we've done some work here at ARACY, put together a paper through a colleague of ours, Laurie Rubenstein, called Love Grows Brains, which I think speaks to the heart of what you're talking about. And those notions of interaction and attachment from, as you say, the very earliest points of a child's life. So, it's a direct answer, I guess, to the question that was asked. It starts essentially as soon as, conception, birth, sometime in that space. So we can't be doing this too soon. I think it's interesting around data gaps, and certainly information that we can gather in that first 1,000 days is difficult. But we can absolutely acknowledge that it's very, very difficult to get data at that point. But I think if we're going to start thinking about really taking this first 1,000 days period of a child's life seriously, we've done a whole lot of work. ARACY and many of our partners through the Strong Foundations collaboration have done significant bodies of work in this space, and we know that we've got to start to address some of those data gaps.
Absolutely. And a 5-year-old, a 6-year-old, 7-year-old have valid things to say about their life and who they are, So, yeah, there's certainly a gap there in trying to appropriately collect that information.
Absolutely. As a parent of an assertive 8-year-old, I can tell you that's true.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Penny. There's I don't have that many more questions. In fact, I think we're down to our last, so take that as a signal to send some more through if you wish. This one goes back to school, and it's asking about schools as competitive places. There was an article in the Sydney Morning Herald last week about how a mother was helping her kids deal with anxiety at school. I don't know if you've seen it. I think it was in the ARACY Daily News. It may not have been. But it's schools are seen as increasingly competitive. There's, spelling bees and all that sort of stuff. What can educators do? Is it a problem? And what can educators do to possibly help children develop a more positive sense of cultural identity in that environment, or what can be changed to make that not the case?
Well, in terms of what the research suggests, we know that establishing, not to use too much academic speak, but healthy group norms, so where it's normalised, people support each other. That's not to say there isn't healthy levels of competitiveness, but it's more the way it's framed, and establishing, I guess, a culture where people support each other to achieve their best has clearly got links to better outcomes more generally. But having said that, this research wasn't specifically on what happens in schools and the education sector. It's just that those two sectors clearly emerged as, if we're talking about levers for change, the two areas in a child's life that can really have an impact on establishing their sense of identity and culture. So yeah, I'm not sure if I directly responded to that question, but certainly that there's research out there that looks at the impacts on certain cultures and standards and norms in a school environment and what kind of outcomes they can produce.
One of the things that I was thinking as you were answering is, again, takes us back to another piece of our work at ARACY. We put out a report a couple of months ago now called Please Just Say You're Proud of Me, which was a youth perspectives piece looking at the impact and how kids wanted to engage with their families toward the end of their schooling, so I guess the latter stage of the work that you've looked at. And I guess it came to mind, the title of the report, Please Just Say You're Proud of Me, comes from a quote from a young woman who we interviewed. I think she was from Queensland as part of that work, or I think it was a letter. One of the things we got the kids to do as part of that report was to write a letter to their ideal support person during that period of their life. And I remember reading that whole quote, so the Please Just Say You're Proud of Me is just part of her quote, and she talks in her, I can't remember it now verbatim, but she sort of says something along the lines of, I'm trying really hard every day to be the best version of me that I can be. It's hard work, but I'm trying my best. And then it goes on to the Please Just Say You're Proud of Me. And I guess that was all talked about in an educational context. We were trying to, sorry, it just makes me tear up every time I say it. But we're trying to understand how they could better get more out of the end of their educational experience. But at the end of the day, even for somebody of 17, 18, what really mattered for them was that they were trying really hard to have the best identity, to be the best version of themselves that I could be. Do you think that that's typical of what the developmental journey of the development of identity and culture?
I think so. I mean, it's all very theory-based, and certainly it's a bit of a journey that's not always linear, and can be affected by characteristics such as gender and other characteristics. But yes, certainly there's a very healthy process of a young person experimenting and trying to work out who they are and where they sit in the broader scope of their society and world, and emerging from that is where they make certain decisions about all those areas. And what we do know is having parental support and community support around that can certainly help that process.
Thanks, Lauren. I guess we've come to the end of our questions.
Pretty close. We've got one or two more. One goes to screen time. The impact of screen time, film, television, etc., on the development of cultural identity. Lauren?
Yeah, so certainly the online space and technology is such an emerging component of a child and young person's life. I have a 3-year-old and I can also attest to that. Look, there is a segment in the literature review that looks at an inquiry from the top of my head, the WA Child's Commissioner into it, not so much screen time, but the online use and how it can be positively used in for the identity and culture development of a young person. So although I didn't look directly at the impact of screen time, certainly I guess the online space is much like the real world. It can be utilised for good or for bad. And I think that's such an emerging area for research. I think there's a lot we still have to learn about that.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that we're a long way from understanding screens, time, the good, the bad, the impact on it, to be fair, not only this domain of the nest, but actually all of the domains of the nest as well. And I think one of the things that's clear to me is that it actually cuts across all of those domains. So more work to be done.
Yeah.
One more question and then we'll wrap it up. This one, does the ARACY practice papers examine the children who are developing bicultural identities, e.g. migrant children and young people from CALD backgrounds?
Just repeat that on this.
So do the practice papers examine children who are developing in bicultural identities? So, migrant children and so
on. Well, not specifically, because again, this project wasn't meant to be prescriptive. So it's more of a guidance about how you can account for those kinds of contexts. So I guess the answer is no, but it provides a bit of scope about how to account for that. Is a short answer.
And certainly I think in a country like Australia, where many children are growing up in multicultural households, almost certainly bicultural households, there are things and the indicators and the domains that you've identified as part of your framework, or the framework of our thinking for this domain, are just as applicable for those kids growing up in those contexts. What remains to be seen and what work needs to be done, and that's work either at a research level or at a practice level where you're working with these families, is actually pulling apart, using those indicators to build your own understanding and what supports are necessary. And that's work that we would ideally love to be involved with. And if you've got stories about how you're doing that, again, please get in touch and let us know.
And certainly in the literature review, we do look at issues around cultural identity and children of migrants as well. So that is accounted for in that report.
Fantastic. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for your time today. Thank you, Lauren, for making yourself available. Thank you to, as we've said, the DSS for providing funding for this piece of work. We are very, very keen to hear your stories on this one. This is something that matters a lot to us, and we know that it matters a lot to the audience out there. The interest in today's webinar has been highly significant, and again, if you've got the stories you'd like to share, if you want to discuss this notion of positive sense of culture and identity more deeply with us, please be in touch through the normal channels. Thank you very much for your time today. Thank you, Lauren, and we hope to see you again soon at another ARACY webinar.
Thank you, Penny. Thank you, Lauren, and thank you everyone who attended. The webinar will be recorded and available very soon on the website for ARACY financial members. And as Penny mentioned earlier, those who aren't financial members but have a real interest in this area, please make contact and we can make those slides available to you. The slides will also be available. If you've got further questions, please also be in contact. We'll deal with them as best we can. Our next webinar is coming up on Wednesday, the 16th of October. That features Warren Cann, who's the CEO of the Parenting Research Centre. And it's sort of the webinar-based version of a very successful series that Parent Research Centre have been running around the country called Practice Reimagined. And it's about making better use of evidence to give families what they need. A lot of it's got to do with proper use of data and good use of data in policy making, and possibly even steering policy makers in the correct direction. So we look forward to that, 16th of October. Please sign up for that now. If you're not an ARACY member, please consider doing so. And again, thanks for your attendance. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.